The Zephyrian Banking Consortium had spent 3,000 years perfecting the art of being insufferably smug about their financial superiority. Their crystalline towers stretched across 17 star systems, each one a monument to the galaxy's unshakable belief that mathematics, when properly applied by superior alien intellects, could solve any problem. The crown jewel of their empire sat on Zirion Prime, the crystalline vault, a fortress so impenetrable that even the void wraiths of the Andromeda Spiral had given up trying to crack it after their third failed attempt resulted in half their fleet being converted into decorative lawn ornaments. The vault's security specifications read like a paranoid engineer's fever dream. Quantum encrypted locks that changed their combinations every nanosecond, gravitational field generators that could compress a grown Altarian into a convenient pocket-sized cube, neural scramblers that turned intruders' thoughts into abstract art, and that was just the lobby. What made the Zephians particularly insufferable was their habit of explaining in excruciating detail exactly why their vault was superior to everyone else's pathetic attempts at security. They'd host annual conferences where lesser species would gather to marvel at holographic displays of their defenses, nodding appreciatively while secretly planning their own doomed heist attempts. The Zephyrians had turned arrogance into an art form, and their masterpiece was the casual dismissal of humanity as those adorable primates who still think paper money is a good idea. This attitude wasn't entirely without merit. Humans had only been part of the galactic community for 47 years, which in cosmic terms was roughly equivalent to a fruit fly's attention span. Their technology was charmingly primitive, their diplomatic skills resembled a toddler's first attempt at negotiation, and their economic policies seemed to be based on the radical concept of, let's see what happens if we try this completely insane idea. Most galactic economists had classified Earth's financial system somewhere between endearing disaster and how are they not extinct yet? The Krillian pirates, however, had a different perspective on humanity's perceived weaknesses. Captain Zaktar, whose species had evolved from predatory pack hunters and whose idea of subtlety involved using slightly smaller explosives, saw opportunity where others saw incompetence. If humans were so hopelessly naive, surely they'd be easy targets for a sophisticated criminal enterprise such as his own. Zaktar's crew consisted of the usual suspects. Vex I, a Thalorian shapeshifter who could impersonate anyone except someone with actual common sense, Grax, a mollusk whose computer skills were matched only by his ability to complain about absolutely everything, and Nyx, a void-born assassin who spoke exclusively in ominous whispers and had never met a dramatic entrance she didn't like. Together they formed the kind of criminal organization that made other criminals question their life choices. The plan was beautifully simple in its complete disregard for consequences. Kidnap a human child, demand ransom, use the proceeds to fund bigger and better criminal enterprises. What could possibly go wrong? The answer, as it turned out, was everything, but in ways that defied conventional understanding of how badly things could go wrong. Tommy Chen, age 8, had been enjoying what his parents optimistically called a cultural exchange vacation on the tourist station orbiting Kepler 442b. The station specialized in introducing alien species to human culture, which mostly involved confused extraterrestrials trying to understand why humans found it entertaining to watch other humans kick a ball around a field for 90 minutes. Tommy, for his part, had been more interested in the station's quantum arcade, where he'd been systematically demolishing high scores set by species with reaction times measured in microseconds. The kidnapping itself was a masterclass in incompetence. Zaktar's crew had spent weeks studying human behavioral patterns, which primarily involved watching old Earth movies and concluding that all human children were either obnoxiously precocious or completely helpless. They'd prepared for everything except the possibility that their target might be neither. Tommy had been in the middle of explaining to a bewildered Centaurian why humans found practical jokes amusing when 3 figures in stealth suits materialized around him. The Centaurian, whose species had evolved from herbivorous herd animals and whose fight or flight response was weighted heavily toward flight, immediately fainted. Tommy, meanwhile, looked up from his juice box with the kind of mild interest usually reserved for particularly boring documentaries. "Are you here to kidnap me?" he asked with the casual tone of someone inquiring about the weather. HFY, who had been prepared for screaming, crying, or at least some form of age-appropriate panic, found himself momentarily speechless. "Well, yes, actually. We are." "Cool," Tommy said, finishing his juice box and tossing it into a nearby recycling unit. "I was getting bored anyway. Do you have snacks on your ship?" The kidnapping proceeded with the kind of surreal normalcy that made everyone involved question whether they were still operating in the same universe. Tommy chatted amiably with his captors about their ship's propulsion system, correctly identified the make and model of their weapons, and offered helpful suggestions for improving their stealth technology. By the time they reached their hideout, Zaktar was beginning to suspect that either human children were much stranger than advertised, or they'd accidentally kidnapped the wrong species entirely. The ransom demand was transmitted to Earth with all the theatrical flair the Krillians could muster. They'd prepared a holographic message featuring dramatic lighting, ominous music, and Zaktar's most intimidating snarl. The message was simple: pay 50 million Galactic credits or never see the child again. They'd even included a brief video of Tommy waving cheerfully at the camera and asking if anyone had remembered to feed his goldfish. Earth's response arrived 6 hours later. It was a form letter. "Dear kidnappers," it began, with the kind of bureaucratic politeness that made root canals seem warm and friendly by comparison. "Thank you for your interest in our citizens. Unfortunately, we cannot process your request at this time due to incomplete paperwork. Please fill out Forms 27B through 94C and resubmit your demands during normal business hours. Have a pleasant day." Attached to the message was a 847-page document explaining Earth's official policy on hostage negotiations, written in the kind of legal language that made tax codes look like children's picture books. The Krillians spent 3 days trying to decipher it before giving up in frustration. Grax had developed what he claimed was a stress tentacle rash, and Nyx had stopped whispering ominously because even she couldn't make bureaucratic forms sound threatening. Meanwhile, Tommy had settled into ship life with the adaptability of a seasoned traveler. He'd reorganized their food storage system, optimized their navigation computer, and taught Vexhide how to play poker. He'd also been asking an alarming number of questions about galactic banking systems, with the kind of intense curiosity that suggested he was either a very unusual 8-year-old or a very small economist. "So," Tommy said one day while helping Grax debug their communications array, "the crystalline vault on Xeron Prime is supposed to be completely impenetrable, right?" Grax's tentacles twitched nervously. "Yes, little human. Why do you ask? Just curious. My mum always says that when someone claims something is impossible, it usually just means they haven't found the right approach yet." "Your mother sounds very wise," Grax replied, not realizing he'd just received what historians would later recognize as the understatement of the millennium. It was Zaktar who first suggested using their unexpected guest as leverage for something more ambitious than simple ransom. If Earth wouldn't pay for the child's return, perhaps they could use him as insurance for a more profitable venture. The crystalline vault had been calling to ambitious criminals for centuries, and while previous attempts had ended in spectacular failure, none of those attempts had involved a human child as their secret weapon. The plan, when Zaktar finally explained it to his crew, was audacious in its complete disregard for conventional wisdom. They would infiltrate the vault, steal everything that wasn't nailed down, and use Tommy as both a hostage and a good luck charm. After all, humans were supposed to be unpredictable, and if there was one thing that might catch the Zephyrians off guard, it was the presence of an 8-year-old in the galaxy's most secure facility. Tommy listened to the plan with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for particularly interesting documentaries. When Zaktar finished his explanation, complete with holographic diagrams and dramatic gestures, Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "That's a pretty good plan," he said, "but I think you're missing something important." "What's that?" Zaktar asked, his pride slightly wounded. "You're assuming the vault is actually secure?" The journey to Xerion Prime took 17 days, during which Tommy continued his systematic questioning of everything related to galactic finance. He wanted to know about currency exchange rates, interstellar trade agreements, and the specific legal frameworks that governed banking across different species. His questions ranged from the technical to the philosophical, and by the end of the journey, even Nix had stopped whispering and started taking notes. Zerion Prime itself was a monument to Zephyrian engineering and their complete inability to understand the concept of subtlety. The planet's surface was covered in geometric patterns that could be seen from orbit, each one precisely calculated to demonstrate mathematical principles that lesser species supposedly couldn't comprehend. The crystalline vault sat at the planet's north pole, a structure so perfectly symmetrical that it made snowflakes look sloppy by comparison. The vault's exterior defenses were exactly as advertised, a labyrinth of sensors, force fields, and automated systems that could detect everything from stray thoughts to loose change. What the Zephyrians hadn't advertised was how remarkably easy it was to walk past them if you knew the right frequency to broadcast on your personal communicator. Tommy had discovered this frequency approximately 3 minutes after their ship entered the system. He'd been tinkering with his handheld gaming device, trying to improve its processing speed, when he'd accidentally intercepted a maintenance signal from the vault's central computer. The signal contained, among other things, a complete map of the facility's blind spots, updated security protocols, and what appeared to be someone's grocery list written in High Zephyrian. "This is interesting," Tommy said, showing the display to his increasingly nervous captors. "Did you know the Vault security system runs on a distributed network that's been compromised by at least 17 different backdoors?" "That's impossible," Grax protested, his tentacles now openly twitching with anxiety. "The Zephyrians have been bragging about their security for millennia." Yeah, but they've also been hiring outside contractors for maintenance," Tommy replied, "and some of those contractors have been really patient." The infiltration of the crystalline vault proceeded with the kind of surreal ease that made everyone involved question whether they were still operating in the same reality. Doors opened before they could attempt to hack them. Security systems politely stepped aside. Guard patrols seemed to be perpetually on break. By the time they reached the vault's inner sanctum, even Zaktar was beginning to suspect that something was fundamentally wrong with their understanding of the situation. The vault's interior was exactly as magnificent as the promotional materials had promised. Walls lined with crystalline formations that served as both decoration and data storage. Atmosphere processors that maintained perfect environmental conditions for artifacts from 1,000 different worlds. And, in the center of it all, a collection of treasures that represented the accumulated wealth of half the galaxy. What the promotional materials hadn't mentioned was the small, unremarkable maintenance panel tucked behind a display case containing the crown jewels of the Altarian Empire. The panel bore a simple label written in a script that looked suspiciously like Earth Standard: "Property of Chen Industries, authorized personnel only." Tommy walked over to the panel and pressed his palm against it. The panel beeped cheerfully and displayed a message that made Zaktar's blood run cold. "Welcome back, Tommy. Your mum says to remind you to brush your teeth." "Surprise," Tommy said, turning to face his captors with the kind of smile that usually preceded very bad news. "I should probably mention that my mum is Helena Chen, CEO of Chen Industries, and Chen Industries has been the Zephyrian Banking Consortium's primary maintenance contractor for the past 30 years. The next few minutes were filled with the kind of revelations that made previous assumptions about reality seem quaint and optimistic. Tommy explained with the patient tone of someone who'd been waiting a very long time to have this conversation that Earth's integration into galactic society had been far more strategic than anyone had realized. While other species had been focused on military might or technological advancement, humans had chosen a different path. They'd become indispensable. Chen Industries, along with a dozen other seemingly innocuous Earth companies, had spent 3 decades quietly infiltrating the galaxy's infrastructure. They'd provided maintenance services, technical support, and system upgrades to virtually every major institution in known space, and with each contract, each software update, each seemingly routine maintenance check, they'd installed a little more of their own code into the galaxy's digital nervous system. "The thing about humans," Tommy said, as Vault security systems across the galaxy began transferring ownership to Earth-based accounts, is that everyone always underestimates our patience. You see immediate results and assume we're impulsive, but we're really, really good at playing the long game. As Tommy spoke, similar scenes were playing out across 17 star systems. Zephyrian administrators were discovering that their supposedly secure networks had been compromised for decades. Other major financial institutions were finding that their most critical systems were suddenly responding to commands from Earth. The galaxy's economic infrastructure, so carefully built over millennia, was quietly changing hands with the efficiency of a well-executed corporate takeover. The Kryllian pirates, meanwhile, were experiencing the unique sensation of watching their careers transition from interstellar criminals to unwitting employees of Earth's new galactic empire. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, but it did require a significant adjustment to their self-image. "So," Zaktar said, once the immediate shock had worn off, "what happens to us now?" Tommy considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "Well, you did technically kidnap me, which is definitely illegal, but you also helped me get access to the vault, which was part of the plan all along, so I guess that makes you accomplices?" "Accomplices to what?" Vexai asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. "The largest corporate acquisition in galactic history," Tommy replied. Earth just became the majority shareholder in approximately 67% of the galaxy's financial institutions. We're going to be really busy for the next few years. The transition of power was handled with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that made previous galactic upheavals look like amateur hour. Earth's new economic dominance was presented as a series of routine corporate restructurings, complete with paperwork that was technically legal, even if it was morally questionable. The Zephyrians, who had spent millennia perfecting their own brand of financial arrogance, found themselves in the unprecedented position of being junior partners in their own empire. Helena Chen, Tommy's mother and the architect of humanity's quiet conquest, addressed the galaxy via holographic transmission from her office in downtown Singapore. She was a small woman with the kind of understated presence that made people forget she was in the room until she started talking. When she did speak, her words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. "Distinguished beings of the galaxy," she began, with the tone of someone delivering a quarterly earnings report, "I want to assure you that Earth's recent acquisitions will be managed with the same care and attention to detail that has characterized our maintenance contracts over the past 3 decades. We have no intention of disrupting existing operations or altering the fundamental nature of galactic commerce." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "However, we will be implementing certain efficiency improvements and updating some outdated policies. For example, the practice of dismissing entire species as primitive or inferior will be discontinued, as it has proven to be counterproductive to long-term business relationships." The galaxy's response to Earth's new position was a mixture of shock, outrage, and grudging admiration. The Zephyrians, predictably, filed a series of legal challenges that were promptly dismissed by courts that had been using Earth-designed legal software for the past 20 years. The Altaorians attempted to organize a boycott, only to discover that their own banking systems wouldn't function without Earth's technical support. The Void Wraiths, whose response to most situations involved creative applications of violence, found that their weapon systems had been mysteriously upgraded, with safety protocols that prevented them from firing on Earth installations. Tommy, meanwhile, had returned to his interrupted vacation, though he now spent his time giving interviews to bemused journalists who were trying to understand how an 8-year-old had become the face of humanity's galactic coup. He handled these interviews with the same patient politeness he'd shown his kidnappers, explaining complex economic concepts in terms that made sense to beings who had previously thought of humans as barely civilized primates. "The thing people don't understand about the kidnapping," Tommy said during one particularly popular interview, "is that it wasn't really about me at all. It was about everyone's assumptions. The Kryllians assumed humans were easy targets. The Zephyrians assumed their security was perfect. Everyone assumed that being loud and aggressive was the only way to get what you wanted. And what did humans want? asked the interviewer, a centaurian whose species had evolved from herbivorous herd animals, and whose questions reflected their cultural preference for indirect communication. "We wanted to be taken seriously," Tommy replied, "and sometimes the best way to get people to take you seriously is to quietly prove that you've been more capable than they realized all along." The Krillian pirates, who had gone from kidnappers to unwitting accomplices to reluctant employees in the span of a few weeks, found themselves assigned to what Earth diplomatically termed security consultation. Their new job involved helping other criminal organizations understand why attempting to rob Earth-controlled institutions was a poor career choice. It was steady work, even if it lacked the excitement of their previous profession. Zaktar, whose species had evolved from predatory pack hunters and whose idea of career advancement had previously involved bigger explosions, discovered that he had a talent for explaining complex security systems to beings who were planning to circumvent them. His presentations, which combined technical expertise with vivid descriptions of what happened to people who ignored his advice, became legendary in certain circles. "The thing about human security systems," he would tell his audiences, "is that they're designed by beings who assume everyone is trying to cheat them, and they're usually right." The galaxy's adjustment to Earth's new economic dominance took approximately 6 months, which in cosmic terms was roughly equivalent to a volcanic eruption. There were protests, legal challenges, and at least 3 attempted revolutions, all of which were handled with the kind of patient professionalism that had characterized Earth's rise to power. The humans, it turned out, were as good at managing galactic upheaval as they were at installing maintenance back doors. The most significant change was cultural rather than economic. The casual dismissal of humans as primitive or inferior became not just politically incorrect, but financially inadvisable. Species that had spent millennia congratulating themselves on their superiority found themselves taking remedial courses in human psychology, trying to understand how they had so completely misunderstood their new economic overlords. The Zephyrian Banking Consortium, once the epitome of galactic financial arrogance, became a case study in the dangers of underestimating one's business partners. Their crystalline towers still stretched across 17 star systems, but now they bore small, discreet plaques reading "A Chen Industries Company." The plaques were written in Earth Standard, which had quietly become the galaxy's second language, while everyone was busy looking the other way. Tommy Chen, who had started this adventure as a kidnapped child and ended it as the reluctant face of humanity's galactic empire, returned to school with the kind of story that made career day presentations remarkably awkward. His teachers, who had been told he'd been on an educational field trip, struggled to incorporate "accidentally conquered the galaxy" into their lesson plans about responsible citizenship. "The important thing to remember," Tommy told his class during a presentation about his summer vacation, "is that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to wait for the right moment. And sometimes the right moment is when everyone thinks you're not paying attention." His classmates, who ranged in age from 7 to 9 and whose previous experience with galactic politics had been limited to arguing over trading cards, listened with the kind of polite attention usually reserved for particularly boring documentaries. They were more interested in the part about living on a spaceship than the part about restructuring interstellar banking systems. Helena Chen, watching her son's presentation via holographic feed from her office in Singapore, allowed herself a small smile. She had spent 30 years building the foundation for humanity's quiet conquest, and it had all come together exactly as planned. Well, almost exactly. She hadn't anticipated the kidnapping, but even that had worked out better than she could have hoped. The galaxy, meanwhile, settled into its new economic reality with the kind of grudging acceptance that characterized most major historical transitions. The Zephyrians discovered that being junior partners in their own empire was actually more profitable than being senior partners in a smaller one. The Alterians found that Earth's technical support was remarkably efficient, even if it came with occasional lectures about cultural sensitivity. Even the Void Wraiths, whose response to most situations involved creative applications of violence, admitted that their new safety protocols had significantly reduced their insurance premiums, and somewhere in the Andromeda spiral, a group of beings who had spent centuries trying to crack the crystalline vault received a message that made them question everything they thought they knew about security, patience, and the relative intelligence of various species. The message was simple and polite, written in the kind of bureaucratic language that made tax codes look like children's picture books. Dear former vault crackers, it began, "Thank you for your interest in our facility. We regret to inform you that the crystalline vault is now under new management. However, we would like to offer you positions in our security consulting division. Benefits include competitive salaries, comprehensive health coverage, and the satisfaction of knowing that your expertise is being used to protect rather than circumvent galactic financial institutions. Please respond during normal business hours if you are interested in discussing this opportunity further." The message was signed by Tommy Chen, age 8, recently appointed Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations for Chen Industries' Galactic Division. It was, observers noted, the kind of job title that would have been laughable if it hadn't been attached to the being who had just orchestrated the largest corporate takeover in galactic history. The story of how humanity quietly conquered the galaxy through superior patience, strategic thinking, and an 8-year-old summer vacation became the subject of academic papers, documentary films, and at least 3 different musical compositions. The moral of the story, according to most analyses, was that assumptions about intelligence, capability, and strategic thinking were often inversely related to loudness, aggression, and public displays of superiority. The Galactic University of Rigel 7 commissioned a comprehensive study on what they diplomatically termed the Chen incident, though privately most researchers referred to it as how we got played by primates. The lead researcher, Dr. Kethvar of the Alterian Academy of Strategic Studies, spent 2 years trying to understand how an entire galaxy of supposedly superior beings had been outsmarted by what they dismissed as a backwater species. The humans, Dr. Kethvar concluded in his final report, weaponized our own arrogance against us. While we were busy congratulating ourselves on our technological superiority, they were quietly learning everything about our systems, our weaknesses, and our blind spots. They turned our dismissal of them into their greatest strategic advantage. The report became required reading in diplomatic academies across the galaxy, though most students found it deeply unsettling. The idea that intelligence might be inversely proportional to the volume at which one proclaimed it challenged fundamental assumptions about galactic hierarchy. Several species filed formal complaints, claiming the report was unnecessarily demoralizing and harmful to established social structures. Meanwhile, Chen Industries continued its expansion with the kind of methodical efficiency that had characterized their initial conquest. They acquired mining rights on 17 worlds, secured exclusive contracts for interstellar shipping lanes, and somehow managed to become the galaxy's primary supplier of both military-grade encryption software and the systems used to crack it. Helena Chen's business model, observers noted, had less to do with traditional economics and more to do with becoming so thoroughly integrated into galactic infrastructure that removing Earth's influence would cause civilization to collapse. The Krillian pirates, now officially designated as Security Consultants Grade A, had embraced their new role with surprising enthusiasm. Zaktar discovered that explaining why criminal schemes wouldn't work was almost as satisfying as executing them, and significantly more profitable. His consultation fees had made him wealthier than his most successful heist, and he had the added satisfaction of knowing that his expertise was being used to protect, rather than circumvent, galactic security. The irony, Zaktar reflected during one of his regular reports to Chen Industries, is that we're better criminals now, that we're not actually criminals anymore. Understanding how to break systems makes us excellent at protecting them. Vexai had found a new calling in diplomatic security, using his shape-shifting abilities to test the effectiveness of various identification protocols. Grax had become the galaxy's foremost expert on secure communications, his natural paranoia perfectly suited to designing systems that even he couldn't hack. And Nyx, whose tendency toward dramatic pronouncements had once been a liability, now worked in corporate communications, crafting press releases that managed to be both informative and vaguely ominous. Tommy Chen, who had started this adventure as a kidnapped child and accidentally become the face of humanity's galactic empire, continued to handle his newfound fame with the same patient politeness that had characterized his interactions with his kidnappers. He gave interviews to journalists who were still trying to understand how an 8-year-old had become instrumental in restructuring galactic civilization, answered questions with the kind of thoughtful precision that made adults uncomfortably aware of their own assumptions, and somehow managed to do his homework despite being the youngest executive in Chen Industries' history. But perhaps the most important lesson was simpler. Never underestimate the species that considers the phrase, "let's see what happens," to be a valid strategic philosophy, because sometimes what happens is that a child's kidnapping becomes the catalyst for the most elegant corporate acquisition in galactic history, and sometimes the galaxy's most guarded vault ends up belonging to the species that everyone assumed was too primitive to understand how banking worked. The humans, for their part, continued to approach galactic politics with the same combination of patience, pragmatism, and cheerful disregard for conventional wisdom that had served them so well. They were, after all, still the species that had looked at faster-than-light travel and said, "That's nice, but have you considered our tax code?" It was, the galaxy slowly realized, going to be a very interesting few centuries. The final irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. The Zephyrian Banking Consortium had spent 3,000 years building the galaxy's most secure vault, protecting it with technology so advanced that lesser species couldn't even comprehend its complexity. They'd hosted conferences, written academic papers, and delivered countless speeches about the superiority of their security systems. They'd dismissed humanity as barely evolved primates whose understanding of economics was charmingly primitive. And in the end, their impenetrable fortress had been conquered not by superior firepower or advanced technology, but by an 8-year-old with a juice box and 30 years of very, very patient planning. The vault, that had withstood attacks from the galaxy's most sophisticated criminals, had fallen to a species that still argued about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Somewhere in the archives of the crystalline vault, now property of Chen Industries, a maintenance log entry recorded the moment when everything changed. The entry was brief, written in Earth Standard, and signed with a child's handwriting. "Fixed the security system." It was backwards. Tommy Chen, age 8, Senior VP of Making Things Work Better. The galaxy would remember many things about the day humanity revealed its true capabilities, but perhaps the most important lesson was the simplest. Never underestimate the species that puts children in charge of summer vacation planning.